Yes, I do love this stuff. And just spend the next 30 minutes with me. I'm going to take you back away and I'm going to take you forward. And I'm going to share a perspective from the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists and a little bit about me. So there's a disclaimer, there's always a disclaimer. The print is fine, of course. The real disclaimer I want you to be aware of is that I come to you with a very singular view. I don't sit here where you sit. I'm not an employer. I'm not coming to you as a supervisor. I don't have to manage the risks that a mine manager does or a leading hand does. I don't even have to control my own actions as a worker. And I'm certainly not a regulator or a minister of this great state of Western Australia. But I am someone who can talk to you about worker health protection, and that is the sole purpose and the existence of the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists. So let me tell you that this is what I want to share. I want to share a perspective on these old diseases and how the conundrum that we have to do something about it requires a new approach, a new level of energy, a new level of devotion, and a specific requirement to get loud and get on with it. So bear with me as I walk through some lessons learned and get us future ready. So this is me. Yes, I do love this stuff. It's everything. I'm prepared to climb in a crude oil tank at BP Kwinana up to my waist in crude oil. I'm prepared to be in the sandy desert in the Pilbara. I'm prepared to be in beautiful parts of the world like Canada for where there are mining operations. And sometimes I get to be clean and tidy and come and represent the AIOH. The AIOH is a relatively small organisation. That's the most common thing people just say to me. They go, really? There's 1,500 or so of you in the country? That's the latest figure. There's about 200 certified occupational hygienists in the country, true story. 100 of them virtually come from Western Australia, so we're pitching above our weight there. So small profession, you're possibly amongst us or you know about our work. Okay, so come back with me now. Back away. I mean, we are literally going back to the 1st century when the first respirators were made of bladders and skins. And we're walking through Western Australia in particularly where we had large-scale silicosis and tuberculosis epidemics in the 50s. And we stood up SGIO for workers' compensation. And I want to share with you a particular perspective because it's a homegrown one. And in the middle of the slide, you'll see an image of this book here, Turning Men into Stone, which is a medical historical journey through the mining industry in our great state. And it talks about tuberculosis and silicosis. It was written by a woman called Creana Fitzgerald. She's a West Australian. And she gave me this book. But she also gave me this magic potion. I'm hoping you can see it on camera. It's 85% aluminum oxide. It's a powder. And in between the years of 51 to 58, all we had to do was dust it around a hermetically sealed room before we go into the mine, and we stay in our change room, we breathe this powder for 15 minutes. And this was your silicosis treatment in a can. So let's hope we've moved on. So now come with me into the 2000s, when these faint signals and mixed messages started to appear around a resurgence of occupational respiratory disease. So I'm pointing to coal workers' pneumoconiosis, which we saw in UK and US was on the rise. I'm pointing to studies released in the 2000s, which said RCS is not only associated with silicosis, but you need to be looking at chronic bronchitis, emphysema, small airways disease, and the list goes on. We also started to learn that of all the presentations of COPD, there's an occupational exposure accountability in there, something that really needs to be explored. And in what was rather a watershed inquiry, it was known as the White Inquiry, named after the sandblaster who was at the centre of the inquiry, we were warned in this country that toxic dust workplace-related disease was going to be on the rise. A lot about nanoparticles, diesel exhaust. So we had these signals, but there were also mixed messages because we had no prosecutions. We had no disease data consistent with these large level of exposures. And the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists, at that point, opposed any reduction to the workplace exposure standard for respirable crystalline silica. Into the 2010s, we had this terrible mine accident in the US, and amongst the 24 dead miners that were autopsied, there were 17 cases of coal workers' pneumoconiosis. So those gentlemen would have died anyway. And that's when we may have been able to hear that the problem is dust control. The problem is mechanation that's in these workplaces. And there was the NIOSH study in 2011 that said that respirable crystalline silica at what is currently the Australian workplace exposure standard level of 0.05 milligrams per metre cubed. If there's a lifetime of that risk, then we'll have 19 of 1,000 people with lung cancer. We'll have 54 with other non-cancer lung diseases, and we'll have 75 with silicosis. Big numbers. So I call the 2015 year the awakening. It's when we heard about black lung again for the first time in centuries, and the rather notable black lung white lies inquiry. Now, this was very big on the East Coast, so maybe you didn't get the memo, but that's the purpose of reflecting on history. So the entire Queensland coal industry was virtually called before the inquiry, and there were a lot of people talking about how shocking it was, how surprising that coal workers' pneumoconiosis had re-emerged in workplaces. So it was a pretty rude awakening, and the hardest part of this all for industry, for health professionals, for regulators, was that it was not a re-emergence of an old disease. It was simply the diligence taken to identify the disease. So we learned things like the health surveillance system in the state of Queensland that was responsible for these actions. Surveillance had not been offered, not read correctly, the x-rays were not read correctly or read at all. There was a false assumption that the only exposure group would have been underground workers, not surface workers. And we learned the hard way through actual illness cases that these working systems, the WHS system, was not protective enough of coal workers. We got a good hint though. We got a hint that it's about the dust. See the dust, measure the dust, talk about the dust, get the dust under control. 2017, there was a fallout from this. This is Australia. We're a modern country. We don't have old disease. But we had to face up to the sobering evidence of a systems failure. And industry, people like us, were reproached for putting so much faith that an x-ray would tell us if it was okay or not. At that point, the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists obviously got involved and said that you know what, there's little point in employers being required to submit their exposure data and their health surveillance data if it's not routinely interrogated, if it's not visible, if it's not analysed, and if there's no accountability and reported back to industry. I want you to ponder on that one. A hard one for me in the year of 2017 was the ABC journalist, Matthew Peacock. He's kind of famous for the asbestos Bernie Banton book and stuff. And he came to a conference of ours and he said, "Be careful, hygienists, you look like you're asleep at the wheel. Your job is dust control. Surely you don't have to wait for a radiographer to tell you you have a problem." 2018, more coal workers' pneumoconiosis, more silicosis, and a bit more uncertainty because in Queensland, you may have read of this, the first cases of silicosis from engineered stoneworkers started to hit the papers. Terrible numbers, 4 out of 5 from one workplace, 7 with progressive massive fibrosis, the terminal stage. And the AIH and NATA, the National Testing Association, weighed in around respirable crystalline silica measurement, and whilst speaking to the common interest of protecting worker health, I had to say, we've got some concerns here for the sampling practices and analytical methods. We're not sure we can get to these lower numbers, and a bit has to be done to make sure we have the precision. And that is because of the extent of variability and significant implications for attaining and demonstrating regulatory compliance at these lower numbers if they're to go down, if the WES is to be reduced. And I think you might know some of these, but let me just quickly walk you through what's on screen. So at the top, a range of different building materials: brick, engineered stone, natural stone, quartz, concrete. Silica is kind of everywhere. It's ubiquitous. Also at the top, we know silica dust makes clouds. Clouds of dust are hard to control. In the middle row there, we've got the principles of particle settling, the physics of these particles, which quite often it's surprising that workers don't understand. They don't see it. It's invisible. But we're talking hours for particles of these size to settle. And that's the sort of information that needs to get to those in control of workplace respiratory protection programs, workplace engineering controls, dust suppression systems, designers of those sort of things. And then the real kicker with silica, isn't it? That it's so fine, it's so hard to control, and it lays down in the lower levels of the lungs, and it does not move, turning men into stone. Picture here is very sad. It's what we think is our first case in 2019, Mr. White, who died at the age of 36, if I'm correct, from silicosis, engineered stone worker in Queensland. So this is when we started to think maybe this is too high a price to pay for employment, definitely, and too high a price to pay for a consumer product like engineered stone. The brother of Mr. White warns that he won't be the last to die. There are many in that sector, there are many in that cohort who are still have significant exposure. And we start to learn about accelerated silicosis. So the numbers here are on the screen, possibly too sad to read, but they're going up. Into 2019 I am, so I think I'm doing fine with my timing. And, you know, this is when the media and the union weigh in. This is when the general public get that awareness. And it's the same year that Safe Work Australia concludes their review into the RCS, or Workplace Exposure Standard, and they're contemplating reducing it from 0.05 milligrams per metre cubed over 8 hours. And they start to talk about the no observed adverse effect concentration and health-based levels and how low we would have to go to avoid lung changes and to be most protective of most people. The Australian Institute in that year also opposed a reduction. And so I'm here to share with you a perspective on that and where we are now in 2023. In that same year, we saw the American Conference of Government and Industrial Hygienists. I caution to tell you that's a scientific body. Unlike you, they don't have to take into account other risk factors they're dealing with. They don't have to take into account the cost of controls. But they came out and derived their TLV, which is over 8 hours, 0.025. In 2020, we're still hearing, we're getting more interest from the general public, and Safe Work Australia moved to reduce the workplace exposure standard to RCS. down to 0.05, and they started to talk about even potentially a short-term exposure limit for respirable crystalline silica and a lowered RCS WES of 0.02 milligrams per metre cubed. This is time to stop and plug West Australians shamelessly again. I'm going to refer to what is known as the Glossop report, authored by Dr. Laurie Glossop, who spent significant time teaching us about the uncertainty of measuring scientifically and in a valid way respirable crystalline silica at these lower levels. That is the challenge of our time. At the same time, awareness campaigns, the AOH's campaign is known as Breathe Freely Australia. It's a free website, and there were roadshows aimed at construction, engineered stone, mining, tunnelling, quarrying. And so then in my journey of discovery, I went back and thought, what happened with that black lung, white lies inquiry? So it was quite horrifying to me to find out that in 2020, some 5 years later, 20 of the 66 recommendations from that inquiry had not been implemented. Great lesson for us there. So, tenfold increase in 10 years of silicosis cases around the country. That's where we were in 2020. In 2021, this is when I think we started to get loud. Hygienists started to get loud. And we started to get involved, and I want to pay credit to the WorkSafe WA, to the WA OSH Commission, and in particular to Dr. Julia Norris for her work in helping us understand the improved technique of CT scans over the X-rays of previous years in Western Australia for silicosis and silica medicals. So Victorians, as they do, they kind of went their own way, and they brought in their own regulations around silica at a certain cutoff. A little bit of science to that, a little bit, as to arriving at the 40% level. And hygienists start to get noisy, and that picture there is of Kate Cole speaking on the project in 2021 about tunnelling and the extent of mechanation that creates this significant issue for dust. Okay, I'm going to move forward. It's enough to say that the future is bleak. I'm quoting there the Renee Carey, Lynn Fritzie study from Curtin University. It's time we got united. And we did. And so where we stand now, we're considering the engineered stone ban at the highest levels of our organisation. It's with WHS ministers now. Which pathway we take. I'm here to say that the AIOH favours a precautionary approach, which is to say that in the absence of absolute conclusive evidence in the shape of ill and dying people, then we will take a position that favours elimination. So we kind of get noisy again now, and we've been in media. The AOH has been in media, print, radio, and television. And I'm actually wanting to show you the video now, please, Ben. This is a video of engineered stoneworker. It's important because it's been translated into Mandarin, and it's been viewed, to my knowledge, 88,000 times on Chinese social media. Thank you.
I worked as a stonemason between the years of 2004 and 2012, working mostly with engineered stone. I was out of the industry for 5 to 6 years before my diagnosis with silicosis. Silicosis is a lung condition caused by inhaling high levels of silica, which causes scarring of the lungs, essentially suffocate from the inside out. You know, to be told that you've got 5 years to live after a job that you worked in for eight to 10 years, you know, it's heartbreaking, and it's so sad to see so many families going through what is a preventable illness. I can't stress enough the importance of the correct respiratory safety equipment, such as full face respirators, being clean shaven so that these respirators actually seal to prevent the dust getting in, because the dust getting in your lungs is what will kill you. It's what's killing me, it's what's killing my friends. So making sure that you are provided from your employer with the correct rated respiratory equipment on top of the wet cutting is paramount to your safety. If you're not sure of the safety equipment provided and you're unsure if your employer knows what they're providing, ask to speak to their occupational hygienist. Ask to see their safety requirements provided by these scientists, because that is the only way you will truly be protected, knowing that the recommendations have come from the correct informed people.
Thanks. Thank you. I have one more video to show you, because I'm certainly running out of time. But these are my concluding lessons. And for the hygienists in this room, go back to your textbooks and you'll get these 4 principles, right? It's also the theme of the certification exam if you decide to sit it. Anticipation, recognition, evaluation and control. Lesson 1, anticipation. I'm here to tell you that the absence of evidence is not the same thing as the evidence of absence. So I was sitting in this period, which on screen you can see from 2010 through to 2020, happily in the 2010 to 2018, not seeing a huge rise in silicosis cases. But that's where we are now. Lesson 2, history can repeat itself unless we do something about it. Building products, asbestos building products, fireproof, soundproof, waterproof, cheap as chips, brilliant. Engineered stone, versatile, won't scratch, non-porous, cheaper than manufactured, cheaper than natural stone in most cases. You get it? Lesson 3, evaluation. You honestly don't have to measure to know that that is not okay. Lesson 4, never stop at lesson 3. If you've got not okay, it's not okay. If you're going back to site tomorrow or back to work and you've got lesson 3, control is where you should be. And the last lesson is a lesson in ethics. If it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. So we had a survey of hygienists in 2022, and they rated their concern for overexposure across mining, construction, tunnelling, engineered stone. Extremely concerned, concerned, and highly concerned, predominantly, the answers across all sectors. So I did have another video to show, but I've run out of time. But we have just launched 12 videos, and one of them speaks to RCS, one of them speaks to diesel particulate, and I'm going to see if I can get them shown maybe at the morning tea or the lunch break. So last plug, Jeff, and you can join us if you like. We're having the AIOH conference in Melbourne in the first week of December, but in Perth, it's in 2024, it's coming to Perth. So you can join us then. Thank you.